as 23 of his own men stood motionless, compelled to watch their leader be methodically murdered. The chieftain's blood mingled with seawater on the deck. The damp wood made the ropes creak. Waves crashing against the hull and heavy breathing were the only other sounds. It was not a battleground. It was far more calculating than that. This man had led attacks across the North Sea and had defended himself alongside these same men, who were now compelled to see him destroyed. It wasn't about killing him, though death itself was not as terrible as what the Vikings had found. They had developed a weapon capable of killing a guy while he was still alive. A weapon that would make him a walking billboard for Viking dominance and send him home, not because of his injuries, but because of what they had taken away from him, his position in the human race. His crew remained completely silent. They were aware that they could be marked for the following lesson with any sound or sympathetic gesture. This was the most ruthless form of instructive theater, a well-planned act of devastation intended to show the audience what happened when the Vikings conquered. This would save the chieftain's life. That was the idea. He would return to his hall, his family, and his village, but he would be a different person, a walking warning, a breathing ghost. The evil core of Viking civilization, which had turned male sexuality into a tool of total control, is exposed by this deliberate cruelty. How did a warrior culture that glorified heavenly gender bending come up with a judicial system that required men to kill one another for alleged sexual offenses? Why were farmers put to death for dressing like women by the same culture that praised Loki for giving birth to a horse? We must travel back a millennium to the time when the Norse gods themselves originally delineated the boundaries between divine privilege and human devastation in order to comprehend this ruthless dichotomy. The drips of blood hit the stable floor as Loki's body convulsed, bones shattering and reshaping, his stallion shape giving birth to an 8-legged creature that would become Odin's horse. This was no disgraceful secret tucked away in the back of Norse mythology. This was a well-known story that had been passed down through the years and carved into wood in the hallways. Shape-shifting god Loki had changed into a mare, mated with a stallion, and had a child, Shire, the ultimate transgression of male bounds, and rather than diminishing his influence, it increased it. However, this is what would kill any mortal man. A human male who even wore women's clothing was put to death. But Loki was praised for his ability to change his reproductive system. The Vikings worshipped the gods because they did more than simply disobey the rules. They broke them, rebuilt them, and experimented with gender like kids do with clay. The god of death, war, and All-Father Odin himself used other women's power. Imagine the Norse pantheon's most male deity, dressed in women's clothing, using feminine power, and carrying out rituals that would result in the murder of any mortal man. You would be killed by the same deed that made Loki divine. In Asgard, Odin sits on his throne and boasts about his feminine magic. A farmer in Midgard is accused of allowing his tunic to fall too low, making it appear too much like a dress, and he is forced to fight or die. In order to recover his stolen hammer, Thor, the thunder god and the ultimate warrior, once donned a wedding gown and veil. The gods chuckled. They praised his cunning. They wrote poems about it. An attempt at the same disguise by a mortal man, he'd find himself chained and bleeding before sunset. Odin continued to violate the laws he imposed on other people. The father boasted that he had learned Satha directly from the goddess Freya. This feminine habit was not concealed by him. He promoted it. He used it to achieve strength that was unavailable to him through purely masculine endeavors, to see into the future, and to comprehend fate. It wasn't simply gods who were allowed to transgress gender lines. Their strength came from that. But, where it gets more extreme, the exact laws that rendered gender bending illegal by death were bestowed upon mankind by these same gods who freely transcended gender boundaries. They'd handed down the social conventions, the legal frameworks, and the cultural expectations that confined mortals in strict masculine performances. An important aspect of Viking society is shown by the mythology. The gods stood for all that mortals were forbidden to be. They served as the fantasy, the unattainable dream, and the release valve. Vikings were able to explore forbidden areas through holy stories, which was appropriate, but only in a fictitious sense through devotion, never through actual action. This was no accident, it was a design. The gods set an example of gaining power by gender violation, but they also prohibited mortals from imitating them. It established a system in which men's fear turned into reverence, and they grew fixated on limits they were unable to cross and abilities they were never able to use. Hear the stories as they were told. When Loki gave birth, the attention was on the amazing 8-legged horse he created rather than shame. The focus of Odin's practice of women's magic was on the knowledge he acquired. The story praised Thor's success in getting his hammer back when he dressed as a bride, but everything changed when the protagonist was transformed from a deity to a human. Mortal depravity was proven by the same acts that showed divine flexibility. Human frailty was shown by the same boundary crossing that demonstrated divine strength. CAS, it wasn't hypocritical to apply the double standard. Hierarchy was involved. Because they were gods, they had the ability to change, transcend, and transgress. Because they were human, humans had to stay immobile, inflexible, and confined. Permission was not given by the holy examples, they strengthened the ban. This is where the darkness really sets in. Mortal confinement was emphasized by the freedom of the gods. Each tale about Loki's metamorphoses served as a reminder to human men of their limitations. Every narrative of Odin's wizardry underlined what information remained prohibited. Every joke about Thor wearing a dress emphasized how mortals would perish if they tried to do the same. This dilemma served as the foundation for the Norse universe. Worship creatures that represent what you must never be. Honor divine deeds that would ruin you. Respect the gods for stepping over boundaries that would result in your destruction. However, mortal men who even glanced at another man deceived a judicial system that was intended to ensure just two outcomes: murder or death, while gods donned dresses to acquire power. Like a drawn sword, the word hung in the air of the hall. Argi, either the accused or the accuser would be dead on the ground 3 seconds later. This was not a metaphor, this was the law. Viking legal codes had created the perfect trap. One word that set forced violence in motion: no trial, just accusations, and instantaneous violence, no inquiry, no chance for defense. This is how the device operated. You are referred to as an argumentative, sexually passive, unmanly, or penetrated person. The law no longer permits you to fight them. It now demands that you do so. Don't accept the challenge. The accusation is legally confirmed by you. Come to terms with your new position as less than human and less than a man. There were just 2 legal choices available to the accused guy, and both of them were execution. Fight your accuser first. Option: win, and you've used violence to demonstrate your masculinity. Technically, if you lose, you still have your reputation intact. Option 2: acknowledge the charge by remaining silent, living, but as a social corpse, devoid of all human dignity and legal rights. The system's inevitability was its genius. Violence was promised by every charge, either direct conflict or the lingering violence of societal death. Truth was not sought by the law, it created violence. Imagine the scene: a busy meadow hall, anger smoldering from the past. Someone wants your status, your woman, and your land. They don't require proof. Witnesses are not necessary. All they have to do is say a single phrase loud enough for other people to hear. Argr, no witnesses, no evidence. The law was transformed into a loaded weapon by a single phrase. You're stuck now. You didn't resist, and you've shown that the charge is accurate. Your voice may lose all legal weight, your family may be shunned, and your property may be taken. You turn into a living, breathing, but socially dead non-person. Fight and lose. Your children keep their inheritance after your death. Your spouse maintains her position. There is still some honor in your name. Death was encouraged by the law over life. It's better to fight to the death than to live with a false allegation confirmed. What happened if you survived, however, was the system's true genius. Win the battle. Have you won? 2. It's not that you're innocent, you've shown that you can. Kill like smoke. The accusation lingers. People whisper that they recall. Perhaps you prevailed because you fought valiantly, as if you had something to conceal. It produced perfect paranoia. Each man turned into a possible accuser. Any gathering could be a trap. The law used masculine worry as a weapon and transformed it into a societal control mechanism that only needed to be enforced out of human fear. Think about the preparation needed. Viking rules specified exactly which insults led to obligatory fighting. Blood must flow whether you accuse a man of stealing, fine him, name him a coward, compensate him, or label him sexually passive. What Viking civilization actually safeguarded is shown by the hierarchy. Not assets, not bravery, but the myth of unbreakable masculinity. The actual words were carefully constructed. Argr is designed to be passive. Strain refers to sexual use. Sorðinn was meant to be penetrated. Every word is intended to set off the destructive legal machinery. The language of violence that passes as law. This is what, however, made it genuinely pernicious. The accused also ran the chance of dying. You have to fight if you say the word. This insult was not innocuous. Mutually guaranteed destruction was what this was. But the system remained. Men kept saying these things, starting these battles, and powering this machine. Why? Because there was a worse option. Property rights, legal status, and social existence were all based on a man's reputation in this society. Combat risk was better than the certainty of suspected femininity. It's better to die upholding the system than to live challenging it. The ecology was produced by the law itself. Professional fighters knew they would probably prevail in confrontation, so they could ruin opponents by allegation. Weaker men were singled out and made to endure disasters they couldn't withstand or fight conflicts they couldn't win. The onlookers were also a part of the mechanism. If you observe an accusation without taking part, you could become the next victim. The statute mandated communal enforcement and audience participation. Everyone joined the system that was capable of destroying them. Because it was voluntary, the trap was ideal. Men were not forced to say these things or respond to these questions by any outside force. They maintained their own incarceration, destroyed one another, and policed themselves. The framework was just provided by the law. The rest was human fear. The darkest part is here. The system operated just as intended, using terror to uphold harsh social control rather than to discover the truth or guarantee justice. Winning or losing each battle served to reaffirm the message. Performance was what masculinity was all about, and failure meant destruction. The Vikings had set up the ideal trap, but they weren't the first society to realize that men's deepest anxieties about their bodies were the simplest way to manipulate them. The longship's deck was meticulously lined up with ropes, none of which were positioned to provide the conquered crew's forced audience with the best view. This was no haphazard violence, this was methodical. Beyond plain brutality, the Vikings had evolved something more complex. They had developed a method for purposeful sexual dominance that might topple entire social hierarchies. The placement was important. Every combatant who was watching could see due to the platform's height. Maximum psychological impact was secured by the angle of constraint. Individual attack was turned into a collective horror by the scheduling, which was always in the daytime and always involved forced witnesses. This was no haphazard violence. It was a science of calculation. Consider what conquest often meant. Take the resources, murder the leaders, and enslave the populace. However, murder produced martyrs, and the deaths of leaders served as rallying points for opposition. The Vikings had found something that worked better. Living ghosts who, just by being cause fear. The selecting procedure was exact. They didn't make a random selection. They went after respected warriors, chieftains, commanders, accomplished raiders, and men whose strength and masculinity were undeniable. The more victims there are, the more destructive the protest. The system operated as follows. Take a rival warband prisoner. Subject the leader to ritualized sexual assault in front of his men rather than having him put to death. Make them observe their leader, the personification of male authority. I release them all after methodically unmanding them. Something more potent than murder had been found by the Vikings. Suffering came to an end with death. Death might be a noble thing. Death made the conclusion obvious. However, this resulted in something worse. Living psychological weapons. As living examples of Viking supremacy, these men returned to their towns. In the aftermath was the genius. Take the devastated crew and the broken chief home. They are unable to conceal what occurred. There are too many witnesses. They are unable to lie. Consistent narratives are guaranteed by the synchronized trauma. They are unable to bounce back. Their own culture's social machinery now works against them. See what occurs next. Conversations halt when the chief enters his own hall. His military band, the men who saw him destroyed, are unable to look him in the eye. His once dominant voice now evokes memories of his oppression in the collective mind. Everyone is reminded of their collective helplessness by his very presence. But when they sent these men home, the real nightmare started. They calculated the ripple effects. The wife of the chief must make an impossible decision. Support her ruined husband and share his embarrassment, or leave him and sever sacred ties. Instead of land and honor, his offspring acquire a reputation for being degraded. His supporters have to keep their distance or risk being tainted. Shame itself had been weaponized by the Vikings. They realized that reputation was more important than life in honor-based civilizations. Killing a father and his sons could result, in retaliation, the destruction of his masculinity while he is still alive, and the completion of the task by his own community. The distraught crew members turned into terrorizers. They returned to their towns with coordinated nightmares. Their collective manly failure resulted from their incapacity to defend their leader. Every man who heard their story wondered, could I have done better? Would I have fought? Would it have mattered? This is where it becomes truly systematic. The Vikings didn't need to assault every captive. They needed only strategic demonstrations. One broken chief could pacify entire regions. The threat became more powerful than execution. Execution had limits, but imagination multiplied horror infinitely. The technology evolved with practice. They learned which acts created maximum psychological damage, which positions triggered deepest shame, and which audiences ensured widest dissemination of terror. This wasn't sadism. This was engineering. Consider the resources saved. Instead of garrisoning conquered territories, instead of maintaining occupying forces, the Vikings created self-enforcing subjugation. The victims' own communities became the enforcement mechanism. Social death required no Viking maintenance. But here's what reveals the true sophistication. They understood recovery was impossible within existing social structures. A maimed warrior might heal and fight again. A ransomed chief could rebuild power, but a sexually degraded leader, the very social system that created his authority now, demanded his destruction. The Vikings had discovered vulnerability encoded in masculine social architecture. The same structures that elevated male dominance contained instructions for their own demolition. They'd found the destroy command hidden in patriarchal programming. The forced witnesses were crucial. Solo victimization might be hidden, denied, or reframed, but collective witness created undeniable social fact. 20 warriors who saw their chief destroyed couldn't collectively forget, couldn't synchronize lies, and couldn't maintain useful denial. Each witness became a walking reminder. Every time these men gathered, their shared trauma surfaced. They couldn't rebuild warrior solidarity, because the foundation, their chief's inviolable masculinity, had been publicly shattered. The warband dissolved, not through death, but through shared knowledge. These broken chieftains became something worse than dead. They became living proof that Viking raiders had perfected a weapon that could destroy entire cultures without swinging a single axe. The Old Norse language had 7 different words for calling a man sexually passive, but not a single word for love between men. Think about what that means. An entire vocabulary engineered for destruction, but silence where affection might exist. This wasn't a linguistic accident. This was architectural design. The Vikings had built shame into the very structure of their language. Let's count them. Argr, the unmanned, and ragura, the cowardly passive strøinn, the sexually used, sorðinn, the penetrated, son sorðinn, the demonstrably penetrated, brother Barney, brother killer, which somehow also meant sexually passive, rosra, the anally passive. Every word was a weapon crafted for maximum damage. Each term carried slightly different implications, different levels of insult, different legal consequences. The precision reveals obsession. Why develop such elaborate vocabulary for something supposedly abhorrent? Why create linguistic scalpels for dissecting masculine failure? The answer lies in function. These weren't just insults. They were legal triggers, social weapons, control mechanisms. Each word opened different pathways to destruction. Some mandated combat, others enabled property seizure, or guaranteed social demolition. But here's what the silence revealed about Viking priorities. Search Old Norse texts for words expressing love between men, affection, tenderness, romantic attachment. The vacuum is deafening. The language literally couldn't express what it systematically destroyed. You could call a man 7 different variations of sexually passive, but you couldn't say you loved him. This linguistic architecture shaped thought itself. Without words for positive male intimacy, such connections became literally unthinkable. The vocabulary channeled all male relationships through competition, dominance, carefully maintained distance. The construction was deliberate. When you can only speak destruction, you can only think destruction. When every word for male intimacy carries death, intimacy itself becomes lethal. The language programmed its speakers for isolation. The language literally made certain thoughts unthinkable. Consider how this worked in practice. 2 men who felt affection had no words to express it safely. Every available term carried implications of feminization, penetration, and social death. The closest they could come was silence, and silence could be interpreted as hiding something worse. The elaboration of shameful vocabulary served another function. It created hierarchies of degradation. Being called ergi was bad. Being called answerinn, demonstrably penetrated, was worse. The gradations allowed for precise social positioning and careful calibration of insult. But the vocabulary went beyond direct terms. The language developed elaborate metaphors, all pointing toward the same obsession: agricultural terms about plowing, animal terms about mounting, and craft terms about hammering. Every field of life provided new ways to articulate the same fundamental terror. The poetry was the worst. Skilled scolds competed to create ever more elaborate ways to imply sexual passivity. Kenning's poetic circumlocutions allowed for artistic destruction. You could destroy a man's reputation in verse so beautiful it would be repeated for generations. Here's where it gets revealing. The same culture that created elaborate praise poems for warriors, complex genealogies for heroes, and nuanced descriptions of courage maintains deliberate poverty in the language of male affection. The contrast exposes priorities. The silence spoke volumes. In a culture that named everything, every type of wind, every shade of horse, every variety of sword, the absence of words for male love was deafening. This wasn't oversight, this was engineering. Watch how the vocabulary shaped behavior. Without words for healthy male intimacy, all closeness became suspect. Men maintained careful distance, performed elaborate heterosexuality, and avoided any gesture that might be misinterpreted. The language created its own behavioral prison. The foreign influence is telling. When Old Norse needed to express Christian concepts of sin, it borrowed Latin terms, but for sexual shaming, they had abundant native vocabulary. The linguistic richness reveals cultural obsession predating Christian influence. Translation became a weapon when Christians arrived. They found ready-made vocabulary for their own obsessions. Argr became a sodomite with barely a shift in meaning. The machinery of shame translated perfectly across religious boundaries. But here's the crucial point. Vocabulary shapes reality. By creating elaborate language for degradation while maintaining silence around affection, Vikings engineered a culture where male intimacy could only be conceived as dominance or submission, never as mutual care. The poets understood this power. They were the engineers of reputation, the architects of shame. A skilled scold could destroy a man more thoroughly than any warrior. Words outlived wounds. Verses persisted past death. Language became the ultimate weapon. The Vikings had weaponized their own language, but they'd also revealed their greatest fear, one that would echo through their women's unexpected freedoms. While men died for touching each other, the Viking wife ran her fingers through her female concubine's hair without anyone batting an eye. The contrast was absolute. The same society that created elaborate machinery to destroy men for suspected femininity barely noticed when women shared beds, exchanged caresses, and expressed physical affection. The silence around female same-sex relations was as total as the obsession with male ones. This wasn't tolerance, it was invisibility. Viking law codes that meticulously detailed every variation of male sexual transgression contained nothing about women with women. The sagas that destroyed men through implication ignored obvious female relationships. The poetry that weaponized male sexuality treated female intimacy as beneath notice. The same act that killed men was Tuesday afternoon for women. Why? The answer reveals everything about Viking sexual control systems. Women's sexuality didn't threaten the foundation of social order because women weren't part of that foundation. They couldn't hold political power, couldn't own substantial property, and couldn't lead war bands. Their sexuality was irrelevant to power structures. A man accused of sexual passivity lost his legal standing, his property rights, and his social existence. But women already lack these things. You can't strip status from those who never had it. You can't threaten masculine privilege in those denied masculinity itself. But this freedom came with a dark price. The invisibility was dubbed. Women could express physical affection because that affection was deemed meaningless. They could share intimacy because their intimacy didn't matter. The same patriarchal structure that policed men so brutally ignored women so completely that their desires became irrelevant. Consider the household dynamics. A wealthy Viking man might have a wife and several concubines. If those women sought comfort with each other, emotional, physical, or sexual, it threatened nothing. The man's masculinity remained intact, his property rights unchallenged, and his social position secure. The sagas occasionally mention these relationships in passing. A queen who loved her handmaiden above all others, and warriors' wives who found solace together during long raids. The language is matter-of-fact without judgment or condemnation, because without a threat to masculine power, there was nothing to condemn. But here's where it gets revealing. This selective blindness exposed the true purpose of Viking sexual policing. It was never about the acts themselves. It was about power, hierarchy, and the maintenance of masculine dominance. Women's sexuality was unpoliced because it was unpolitical. The tolerance revealed something terrifying about what Vikings really protected. They weren't protecting sexual morality. They weren't maintaining natural order. They were protecting the specific configuration of power that made men dominant. Any male sexual variance threatened that dominance. Female variants existing outside power structures threatened nothing. This created strange freedoms within oppression. Viking women could express same-sex affection, seek female comfort, and build intimate female relationships as long as they didn't challenge male authority. Their emotional lives belonged to them precisely because Vikings considered those lives worthless. The legal codes make this explicit through absence. Hundreds of laws about male sexuality, nothing about female. The law concerned itself with what mattered: male reputation, male property, and male power. Women's relationships with each other fell outside legal concern, but watch how this shaped female survival strategies. In a world where men might kill each other over accusations of femininity, women created networks of mutual support, invisible to male violence. They built emotional structures men couldn't police because men couldn't conceive them as threatening. The concubine system reveals the paradox starkly. A man might keep multiple women for his sexual use. If those women turned to each other for emotional or physical comfort, it was expected. The alternative, jealousy, competition, and isolation, would disrupt household peace. Female intimacy served patriarchal stability. Christian observers later noted this with confusion. They arrived expecting to condemn all same-sex activity, but found Viking men obsessed with policing each other. While women openly shared affection, the missionaries had to create new categories of sin to address what Vikings had systematically ignored. The archaeological evidence supports this blindness. Grave goods, household arrangements, artistic representations, etc., all suggest female relationships that historical texts ignore. Women buried together with interlocked hands, shared personal items between unrelated women, and architectural spaces designed for female gathering. But the ultimate revelation is this: Viking men were so focused on destroying each other over masculine reputation that they created spaces where women could experience what men couldn't: uncomplicated same-sex affection. The price was invisibility, irrelevance, and exclusion from power, but within those constraints a different world existed. The double standard wasn't kindness, it was the purest expression of patriarchal logic. Police threaten power, ignore what doesn't. Women's relationships with each other were free precisely because Vikings considered them meaningless. Women's bodies weren't policed because they weren't seen as capable of the kind of destruction Viking men feared most: the total annihilation of masculine identity that lurked in every male friendship. The man with the severed hand counted his silver compensation while behind him another man was dragged away to die for words alone. Viking law had a price for everything. Cut off a man's thumb, 12 ounces of silver. Blind him in one eye, 24 ounces. Call him sexually passive, your life or his, no other currency accepted. The legal mathematics revealed everything. Physical maiming had specific compensation rates, carefully calculated and precisely defined. But sexual insults existed in a different category entirely. They couldn't be bought off, paid away, or compensated through wealth. They demanded blood. You could literally buy your way out of maiming someone. But here's how the system worked. Viking law was built on compensation. Your money carefully negotiated payments that prevented feuds. Break a man's leg, pay the price, move on. The injured party could refuse compensation and demand violence, but social pressure encouraged accepting payment. But sexual accusations shattered this entire framework. There was no compensation rate for being called an arguer. No amount of silver could restore masculine reputation. The law removed monetary options, mandated combat, and ensured destruction. Think about what this means. In Viking values, a functioning hand was worth less than an intact masculine reputation. Physical wholeness could be compensated. Social masculinity was beyond price. A chair so far beyond that its loss required death. The legal code revealed what Vikings feared more than death itself. The distinction wasn't subtle. Laws spelled out exact compensation for every possible injury. Lost fingers, broken teeth, and damaged organs all had prices, but the moment sexual passivity entered the equation, the economic system collapsed. Money became meaningless, only violence mattered. This created perverse incentives. Assault someone physically, face predictable financial consequences. Assault their masculinity verbally, and face mortal combat. The law incentivized physical violence over verbal, breaking bones rather than speaking words, maiming rather than implying. But watch how this hierarchy functioned socially. A man who'd lost fingers in battle wore his maiming proudly. The compensation he'd received proved his injury's worth. But a man who'd faced sexual accusations, no amount of silver could make him whole. No payment could restore him. And this wasn't some obscure law halal. It was the foundation of their entire system. The inequality was intentional. Physical injuries healed or didn't. Either way, they were finite, but reputation was eternal. A damaged body remained functional. A damaged masculinity ceased to exist socially. The law recognized this through its refusal to price what it considered priceless. Consider actual cases from the sagas. A farmer who accidentally castrated another man's bull paid 40 ounces of silver. A merchant who questioned another's manhood died in single combat. Animal fertility was worth 40 ounces. Human masculinity was worth everything. The system created its own logic. Why risk sexual insults when physical assault was safer legally? Why question masculinity when breaking bones carried predictable consequences? The law channeled violence into acceptable forms, physical rather than social destruction. But here's where it gets complex. The same legal system that priced every physical injury refused to acknowledge sexual assault as a compensable injury. A man subjected to sexual violence couldn't claim compensation. The act itself destroyed his legal standing to make claims. The violence erased the victim's ability to seek justice. This wasn't oversight, this was the design. The law protected masculine reputation, not male bodies. It valued social position over physical integrity. A man could lose organs and remain legally whole, question his sexuality, and cease to exist as a legal person. The Christian conversion revealed this starkly. Missionaries struggled to understand why Vikings would accept compensation for extreme physical violence but demand death for verbal insults. They were seeing different value systems. Christians focused on bodily harm, Vikings on social existence. The archaeology confirms these priorities. Weapons buried with warriors show extensive repair, evidence of bodies that sustained and survived. Massive physical trauma, but no saga celebrates survival of sexual accusation. Physical wounds created stories. Social wounds created silence. Medieval legal documents show the evolution. As Viking regions Christianized, sexual insults gradually acquired monetary penalties. But the transition was slow and contested. Communities clung to combat solutions generations after accepting compensation for physical violence. The persistence reveals deep programming. Vikings had built masculine reputation into the foundation of their legal system. Every other injury could be integrated into economic exchange, but masculinity itself remained outside commerce, beyond negotiation, worth more than flesh or silver. The Vikings had built a society where a broken bone healed, but a questioned masculinity meant annihilation. An ETM, a priority system that would find its perfect successor in an unlikely source. His children were pulled away when he walked through the village. His wife wouldn't meet his eyes, and his voice, once commanding, now made people flinch. Social death in Viking society wasn't a metaphor. It was a systematically enforced erasure that transformed living men into ghosts that happened to breathe. The machinery of exclusion was precise, collective, and inescapable. The process began immediately the moment accusation became fact through combat, loss, acceptance, or overwhelming witness. The social machinery activated. Every relationship, every interaction, every basic human connection was severed or transformed. He was breathing, walking, and talking, but everyone treated him like a ghost. First came the legal death. The man lost his right to speak at assemblies. His testimony became worthless in disputes. He couldn't own significant property, make binding contracts, or seek legal redress for wrongs. The law erased him from civic existence, but legal erasure was just the beginning. The social mechanics were crueler. Former friends crossed streets to avoid meeting. Business partners dissolved agreements. Neighbors who'd shared meals for decades suddenly found urgent tasks whenever he approached. The physical choreography of avoidance was elaborate. Watch a socially dead man enter a market. Conversations halt mid-word. Bodies angle away. Children are quietly redirected. A bubble of empty space forms and moves with him through the crowd. His own brother had to publicly disown him or face the same fate. Faced impossible choices. Association with the socially dead was contagious. Support him and share his fate. His wife could leave without shame. Lech's marriage to a non-person wasn't binding. His children could be claimed by maternal relatives. His brothers had to publicly denounce him or face suspicion themselves. The cruelest mechanism was the corruption of memory. Stories were retold with him erased. Victories he'd contributed to were reattributed. Friendships were retroactively denied. The community collaborated in rewriting history to exclude him even from the past. But the cruelest part was what happened at the next harvest. Social death meant exclusion from collective labor. Viking society depended on cooperation. Barn raising, harvest gathering, ship repair. The socially dead couldn't participate. Their labor was refused. Their presence at communal work poisoned the effort. This created an economic death spiral. Without communal support, farms failed. Without social networks, trade became impossible. The socially dead often faced literal starvation amidst plenty. Surrounded by food they couldn't access through social exchange. The religious dimension intensified isolation. The socially dead couldn't participate in sacrifices, seasonal festivals, or communal rituals. They were barred from the very ceremonies that defined community membership. Gods themselves were understood to reject offerings. From the dishonored, even death offered no escape. The socially dead faced exclusion from proper burial rites. Their bodies might be disposed of in bogs, boundaries, or liminal spaces, with no memorial stones, no grave goods, and no integration into ancestral landscapes. Erasure extended beyond death into eternity. The mechanics required collective enforcement. One person showing mercy could break the system. So the community policed itself, watched for signs of sympathy, and punished compassion as complicity. Kindness became dangerous. Humanity became a threat. Children were trained in the choreography of exclusion. They learned to recognize the socially dead, to perform avoidance, and to understand association as contamination. The system reproduced itself through generations, encoding exclusion into cultural muscle memory. But here's what made it truly systematic: the gradient of social death. Not all faced total erasure. Some experienced partial death. You never chaw, excluded from certain spaces, but not others. Denied some relationships, but not all. The variability made the threat more potent. You never knew how far you'd fall. The partially dead became enforcers. Desperate to avoid further descent, they performed exclusion most vigorously. They policed boundaries they barely remained within. Their precarious position made them perfect instruments of system maintenance. Communication itself became the socially dead could speak, but who would listen? They could explain, but explanations from non-persons carried no weight. They could proclaim innocence into silence that swallowed words without echo. The physical markers accumulated. Denied grooming assistance. Appearance deteriorated. Excluded. From communal meals, bodies showed deprivation. Barred from collective warmth, they bore marks of exposure. Visual difference reinforced social distance. Seasonal cycles amplified suffering. Winter meant death without communal wood sharing. Summer meant failed harvests without collective labor. Spring meant no seed sharing for planting. Fall meant no participation in preservation that enabled survival. The sophistication was breathtaking. Vikings had created systematic exclusion that required no guards, no walls, and no physical enforcement beyond collective will. The prison was everywhere and nowhere. The guards were everyone and no one. The Vikings had perfected something worse than execution, a living death that turned victims into weapons against their own communities, an innovation that Christian converts would soon perfect. The priest's Latin rang through the monastery. Sodomita, different language, different god, exact same destruction. Christianity arrived in Viking lands, promising salvation, but delivered amplification. The new religion didn't dismantle the machinery of sexual policing, it deeply upgraded it. Where Vikings had earthly consequences, Christians added eternal damnation. Where Norse law ended at death, Christian law extended past it. The conversion revealed something crucial. The system for destroying men through sexual accusation was too useful to abandon. It just needed new vocabulary, fresh justification, and divine backing. The Vikings had built the engine. Christians simply changed the fuel. Christians claimed to bring salvation, but they brought something else. Watch the transformation. Argr became a sodomite. The concept translated perfectly. The accusation still destroyed. Combat was replaced by confession, but the outcome remained. Social death. The machinery hummed along, barely missing a beat. But Christians innovated where Vikings had been limited. Norse consequences were earthly: loss of property, status, life. Christian consequences were eternal: damnation, hellfire, separation from God forever. The stakes infinitely multiplied while the basic structure remained intact. The new religion didn't liberate, it perfected the machinery. Here's what Christians recognized. Viking sexual policing already aligned with Christian obsessions. Both systems positioned male sexual passivity as the ultimate transgression. Both created elaborate mechanisms for punishment. The theological framework was different, but the practical destruction was identical. Christian innovation came through universalization. Vikings had focused primarily on the passive partner, Christian, the penetrated, the feminized. Christians condemned both partners equally. The active participant, previously less stigmatized under Norse custom, now faced equal damnation. The net widened. The confession system created new horrors. Vikings demanded public combat, i.e. violent but brief. Christians demanded detailed confession, i.e. torture extending indefinitely. Describe your sins, enumerate your failures. Relieve yourself of your shame before God and priest. The destruction became internal and endless. Now both partners were damned, closing the last loophole. Penance replaced combat but maintained destruction. Instead of dying in battle, the accused performed public humiliation, crawling on knees, wearing sackcloth, and fasting under starvation. The social death looked and functioned identically. Exclusion, shame, erasure, the written word amplified. Consequences. Viking accusations were oral, limited by memory and proximity. Christian records were permanent. Confessions were documented. Scenes were archived. Your destruction was literalized in Latin, preserved for eternity. But here's where Christians truly innovated. They made the system self-enforcing through soul terror. Vikings required external accusation. Christians internalized the machinery. Your own conscience became the accuser. Every thought, every glance, every involuntary response became potential damnation. The vocabulary expanded precisely where Norse had 7 words for sexual passivity. Church Latin developed dozens, canonical texts, elaborated categories and variations of sin. The taxonomy of destruction became a theological science. Monasteries became laboratories for perfecting the system. Men sworn to celibacy, living in close quarters, terrified of their own bodies. Every natural response became sin. Every human feeling required confession. The machinery of shame found its perfect testing ground. The visual culture changed but maintained focus. Vikings carved accusations into wood, temporary insults. Christians carved warnings into stone, eternal reminders. Church facades displayed sodomites tortured in hell. The message permanence increased exponentially. Legal fusion created hybrid horrors. Christian law layered onto Viking custom. Ecclesiastical courts handled soul crimes, while secular courts maintained blood justice. The accused faced double jeopardy, earthly punishment, and eternal damnation. The systems reinforced each other, but the crucial innovation was making women equally subject to sexual policing. Viking invisibility of female relationships ended. Christians discovered female sodomy, created categories for women's sins, extended the machinery to encompass all bodies. The loophole closed. Conversion narratives revealed priorities. Sagas celebrating Vikings accepting Christ focused on sexual reform. Former raiders proved Christian virtue by policing sexuality more vigorously. The religion changed. The obsession intensified. The enforcement mechanisms evolved. Viking accusations required public forums. Christian surveillance penetrated private spaces. Confession made every Christian an informant on themselves. The panopticon was built from conscience. Here's the darkest innovation. Forgiveness that didn't forgive. Christianity promised redemption while maintaining destruction. You could be absolved yet remain marked. Forgiven yet excluded. Saved yet suspected. The double bind perfected psychological torture. The architecture reflected priorities. Viking halls were built for public accusation. Christian churches created confessional spaces, intimate architectures of shame. The destruction became private, personal, and infinitely repeatable. Christianity had taken the Viking system and made it eternal. No longer could death end the shame. Now it followed you into the afterlife itself. Every conversation between men became a careful dance. One wrong gesture, one misinterpreted glance, and the legal machinery would grind them to dust. Viking men developed elaborate codes for navigating their world's sexual minefield. These weren't written rules, but embodied knowledge, passed through example, learned through observation of who survived and who didn't. The choreography of masculine safety became second nature, performed without thought. Physical spacing was critical. Too close suggested intimacy, too far implied fear. Men calculated distances, maintained specific witnesses to every interaction, and ensured witnesses to every interaction. The geometry of conversation became survival mathematics. Men developed elaborate rituals just to have a conversation. Watch two Viking men meet. The approach was oblique, never direct. Eyes focused past each other, acknowledging presence without lingering contact. Weapons visible, prominently displayed. The sword says what the mouth cannot. I am dangerous, therefore, not feminine. Greetings were formulaic and ritualized and referenced violence, women, and masculine achievements. Every conversation began with establishing credentials of manhood. Asterisk. The weather was discussed through warfare metaphors, trade through competition language, and even friendship required violent framing. The buddy system was essential but dangerous. Men needed allies but couldn't appear too close. The solution was triangulation. CHS always interact in groups of 3 or more. 2 men alone suggested intimacy. 3 maintained safe social dynamics. The safest strategy was to never be alone with another man. Public spaces provided protection through visibility. Private meetings invited suspicion. Business was conducted in markets. Negotiations happened in these halls. Important conversations required audiences, witnesses to masculine performance, insurance against accusation. Alcohol created specific dangers. Drunkenness loosened control, revealed affection, enabled accusations. Men developed drinking protocols. With not 5. Never match cups directly. Maintain weapon readiness. Perform aggressive masculinity more vigorously as intoxication increased. Gift-giving required careful navigation. Too generous suggested affection. Too stingy implied fear. Gifts were framed as competition, dominance, obligation, and never care. The language around exchange eliminated emotional content and transformed generosity into aggression. But some took incredible risks for moments of genuine connection. Physical contact was codified precisely. Warriors could embrace after a battle of violence. Sanctified touch. Fathers could touch sons until specific ages. Brothers had limited allowances. All contact required justification. Context, witnesses. Casual affection was lethal luxury. Travel created unique challenges. Ships with enforced proximity developed elaborate protocols. Sleeping arrangements, watch rotations, and work assignments are all structured to minimize dangerous intimacy. The confined space became a hyper-regulated masculine theater. Emotional expression found coded outlets. Grief for dead companions was acceptable. I think the dead couldn't reciprocate dangerous affection. Poetry allowed emotional content if sufficiently violent in framing. Sagas celebrated friendship through descriptions of shared violence. Never shared tenderness. Age provided certain freedoms. Elderly men past warrior prime faced less scrutiny. Their masculinity, proven through survival, was less questioned. Some found late-life companionship impossible in youth, but age brought its own vulnerabilities. Physical weakness reawakened feminine associations. Class affected navigation strategies. Wealthy men had more resources for maintaining distance, separate halls, numerous witnesses, and elaborate households, preventing isolation. Poor men forced into closer quarters faced greater risks. Economic vulnerability meant sexual vulnerability. Seasons shaped behavior. Winter's confined quarters increased danger. Summer's movement provided escape. Spring celebrations required heightened performance. Autumn harvests demanded collective labor while maintaining individual boundaries. The calendar became a coded survival guide. Foreign travel offered temporary reprieve, away from home communities. Some men found different possibilities, but return meant resuming performance. Stories of foreign lands contained warnings. Men who went soft abroad forgot Viking ways and faced destruction upon return. The marriage imperative wasn't about desire but defense. Wives provided sexual and social proof and masculine credentials. Children demonstrated vitality. Failed marriages suggested failed masculinity. The pressure to perform heterosexuality was survival pressure. Occupations carried different risks. Warriors maintained masculinity through violence. Farmers through physical labor. Craftsmen faced suspicion. Delicate work suggested feminine qualities. Poets walked dangerous lines. Wordcraft was women's magic, but scolds held power. Religious roles provided complex navigation. Pagan priests performed feminine rituals while maintaining masculine authority. The contradiction required careful management. Christian conversion offered new frameworks but maintained old dangers. The constant vigilance was exhausting. Every interaction calculated, every friendship dangerous, every moment of genuine feeling potentially lethal. Men lived in perpetual performance, unable to rest, relax, or relate without risk. The system had turned every man into his own prison guard, but this self-policing would become the template for a control mechanism that would outlive Vikings, Christians, and entire civilizations. The same accusation that triggered axes in Viking halls and whips in monasteries now triggers fists in schoolyards. The weapons change, the wound remains. The machine the Vikings built has outlived their gods, their language, and their civilization. It adapted, evolved, and shed its skin like a serpent. But the core mechanism endures. The technology for destroying men through sexual anxiety has proven more durable than any empire. Trace the evolution. Viking argot became Christian, sodomite became Victorian, invert became a modern slur. The vocabulary mutates, but the function remains constant. Words that trigger masculine panic demand a violent response. Enforce behavioral boundaries through terror. The words changed with each century. But listen to the fear beneath. The legal framework evolved but maintained structure. Viking combat became Christian. Penance became criminal. Prosecution became social ostracism. The enforcement mechanisms shifted from axes to authorities to anonymous harassment. The destruction adapted to available technologies. Watch how each era thought it was progressing while perfecting the same machinery. Enlightenment thinkers medicalized what Vikings had criminalized. CLT is not about creating a diagnosis where there had been an accusation. The destruction became scientific, wrapped in psychiatric vocabulary, but the outcome remained social: death. The Industrial Revolution democratized the technology where Viking accusations required public forums. Industrial cities enabled anonymous destruction. Urban density created new surveillance methods. The panopticon expanded from village to metropolis. Every generation thought they'd left it behind. But modern variations seem different but operate identically. Playground taunts that trigger violence. Locker room policing of masculinity. Online harassment campaigns. The same mechanism. Weaponized masculine anxiety functions through whatever medium each era provides. The persistence reveals the machine's elegance. It requires no central authority, no explicit laws, and no formal enforcement. It runs on fear alone. Each generation of men teaches the next to police themselves, passing trauma disguised as tradition. Schools became training grounds. Boys learn early that certain accusations demand violent responses. They don't know they're reenacting Viking law. They think they're just surviving childhood. The machinery reproduces itself through playground dynamics. The machine had become so perfect it no longer needed laws. Legal liberation didn't dismantle the mechanism. Decriminalization removed formal penalties while social destruction continued. Men could no longer be legally prosecuted but could still be socially executed. The machinery simply shifted from courthouse to culture. Corporate environments developed sanitized versions. Not access, but exclusion from networks. Not combat, but career destruction. The glass ceiling has a twin, the lavender ceiling, professional. Death for those who trigger masculine anxiety in colleagues. Military institutions perfected the Viking template. Intense male bonding is required for unit cohesion. Simultaneous terror of that bonding crossing undefined lines. The contradiction creates pressure cookers of masculine performance. Ancient patterns in modern uniforms. Sports culture maintains the tradition most purely. Physical combat sublimated. Intercompetition, team bonding must never become affection. Locker room policing that echoes the hall dynamics. Vikings would recognize every element. Digital platforms amplified the machinery's reach. One accusation can now destroy globally, instantly, and permanently. The internet archives shame eternally. Digital footprints make erasure impossible. The technology evolved to match available tools. But here's the revelation. The machine persists because it works. Not for human flourishing, but for social control. Isolated men are easier to govern. Fearful men don't form threatening bonds. The machinery serves power by atomizing those who might resist collectively. Each era's rulers discovered the same tool. Vikings maintained warrior hierarchies. Christians enforced religious authority. Industrialists prevented worker solidarity. Modern systems maintain consumer isolation. the application changes, the mechanism endures. The international spread reveals universal application. Cultures with no Viking contact independently developed similar mechanisms. The technology appears wherever masculine dominance requires protection through male isolation. The pattern transcends specific origins. Mental health statistics document the damage: male suicide rates, addiction patterns, emotional isolation, and touch starvation. The machinery's victims fill therapists' offices describing symptoms of ancient wounds in modern vocabulary. Resistance movements reveal the mechanism through opposition. Every push for male emotional freedom triggers violent backlash. The machinery defends itself through those it imprisons. Victims become enforcers, protecting their own cages. The cycle continues. Boys watching screens learn what boys watching Vikings learned: that masculinity means isolation, that intimacy threatens identity, that safety requires distance. Different medium, same message, eternal wound. Which brings us back to that longship deck where a chieftain is about to discover that the Vikings had built something that would outlive their gods, their culture, and their civilization itself. The sun was setting as they finally untied him. From the longship deck, 23 warriors stood in the same positions they'd held for hours, frozen by what they'd witnessed. Their chief, who'd led them through a dozen raids and who'd stood first in every shield wall, had been systematically unmanned while they watched. But now we understand what was really happening on that deck. This wasn't random brutality. This was the deployment of a weapon more sophisticated than any sword, more lasting than any wound. The Vikings had discovered how to weaponize masculinity against itself, creating a technology of control that would outlive their civilization by 1,000 years. The chief would live. That was the point. He'd return to his village, carrying invisible wounds that would never heal. His wife would leave him, not from cruelty, but from social necessity. His sons would disown him to preserve their own futures. His warriors would disperse, unable to follow a leader touched by such shame. Every person he met would know. The synchronized trauma of 23 witnesses ensured the story spread. No exaggeration needed. The truth was devastating enough. He'd become a living advertisement for Viking power. Neat, not through his death, but through his continued existence as a social ghost. The ripples would spread. Neighboring villages would hear, allied chieftains would reconsider resistance. The technology was efficient. One man's destruction could pacify entire regions. Why fight when defeat meant not death, but something worse? But the Vikings had built something larger than they understood. They thought they were creating a tool for conquest. They'd actually engineered a self-perpetuating machine for human isolation that would survive their gods, outlive their language, and adapt to any culture that adopted it. Watch how it evolved. The same chief, subjected to ritual humiliation on a Viking deck, would have been labeled a sodomite by Christian accusers centuries later, would have been diagnosed as deviant by Victorian doctors, and would be destroyed through social media campaigns. Today the methods change, the machine endures. The brilliance was in making victims into enforcers. Every man who survived such destruction became invested in the system that destroyed him. Better to police others than risk further fall. The machine recruited its own guards from those it imprisoned. That longship deck was a laboratory where Vikings perfected technologies we still live with. The careful positioning of witnesses. We call it public shaming now. The ritualized nature. You've bureaucratized it. The return of the living victim. You've digitized it. Every element persists in translated form. The 23 warriors who watched would never be the same. They'd seen their chief, the embodiment of masculine power, reduced to nothing. The lesson was clear. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. They'd police themselves and each other with new vigor, terrified of suffering the same fate. Some would have nightmares. Others would become hypervigilant, performing exaggerated masculinity to ward off suspicion. A few might have felt sympathy but could never express it. The witnessed trauma would ripple through their lives, affecting every relationship, every interaction. The chief himself faced a kind of death. That death would have been mercy beside. He'd walk through his own hall as a stranger, sit in his own chair as a ghost, and speak with a voice no one would hear. The Vikings had discovered how to kill someone while leaving them breathing, but they'd also revealed the system's weakness. Any mechanism based on fear contains its own destruction. The very intensity required to maintain such control eventually exhausts those enforcing it. The machine runs on human misery. Eventually humans seek alternatives. Yet here we are a millennium later, still living in the machine's shadow, Different words, same wounds, different enforcers, same enforcement. The Vikings built so well that their invention outlived everything else about their culture. The lesson from that longship deck echoes across centuries. The most effective prisons are those we build in each other's minds. The most lasting conquests are those that make the conquered police themselves. The deepest wounds are those that turn human connection into a threat. The sun has set completely now. The longship disappears into darkness. But the machine the Vikings built on its deck still runs, grinding through generations, powered by the inexhaustible fuel of human fear about what it means to be a man. The chieftain stumbles toward shore, forever changed. Behind him, 23 men stand silent, knowing they've witnessed something that will haunt not just their dreams, but their children's dreams. The machine claims another victim. The cycle continues. The wound endures.